So part of that, I mean, that there's no more direct correlation to make, which is the Democratic Party has taken this issue not only for granted, but it shows it no respect. And I'm not so sure that the industry itself has demanded or asked for that respect in kind. And that, in many ways, what we're navigating right now is, I'm sure you've seen in the press, that it's often referred to as either the medical marijuana or cannabis industry, right? Now, let's be honest. It is an industry. Whether or not we like it, or whether or not we like that term, it is in the multitude of facets and the amount of money poured into it, both illicitly and legally. That's the challenge that the industry itself and the community, however you want to dice that up, right, has to deal with. And I think that when you look to our federal representatives who are not taking a stand, and it took San Francisco United everything short of arm twisting to get Mayor Lee to essentially issue a tepid written statement on a Friday afternoon that was not even released to the press to say that he sort of kind of maybe on a good day when it's sunny supported medical cannabis, I think speaks volumes as to what's happening, which is I think that folks in the movement regarding medical cannabis and the whole entire issue of drug policy really need to pause for a moment, right, and ask, how do we make ourselves relevant, right? How do we connect to other larger movements? How do we influence politicians? How do we actually affect positive change within the political movement? Part of that, quite honestly, whether we like it or not, is money. It's knowing that if you come to some legislator's office in Sacramento and they say, whether it's ASA or some other group or some coalition thereof, and they say, we're behind you, and then in November they see 100 people turn out in the streets for them, right? Or they see campaign donations or checks, and they say, you know what, this is what medical cannabis means. This is what the support of medical cannabis means, right? It actually means something to get our endorsement, right? We're not just going to sit there and give lip service to you. We're actually going to give you direct action. I think that is something that this community needs to look and say, whether it's 2 years down the line, 4 years down the line, say this is where we want to be and work backwards from there. I think rather than we're in a very reactive mode right now, and we have been for the last several years. I think the U.S. Attorney and the Department of Justice actions have taken obviously everybody by surprise. Now that initial shock has worn off, it's clear we do not have allies within the Obama administration or the Department of Justice, and we should not be surprised by that. That's the reality we're facing, and we should deal with that from that point on. But I think your question is a predominantly relevant one that this larger group has to focus on. It's as much access for patients as it is relevance to the real politic that happens in Sacramento and happens in Washington, D.C. How to effectively affect change in a way that actually respects our ideals and actually advances the issue forward and defends sort of what people have fought for the last 15 years.
First Edmund, and then you.
And continuing the same question, President Obama was in Colombia this past weekend, and he said that it's time to start having a national talk about it. I think we should pursue that so the national talk can take place in California and other places. He said that while he was in Colombia, it's time to have a national talk about it. So we need to get people in Sacramento and all across this place to schedule, because I'm not voting for a president who's not going to be Obama, because I know the next president will try to destroy marijuana. I've seen that over and over happen. So it'll be like we go back to Dolores Park again if Obama doesn't make it this time. So we need to have a national talk with 18 states, 6 states voting. There's no more Amsterdam. Today the Republicans are taking the food stamp, $33 billion. SNAP, we want to call it dignity card anyway. So they're going to give you vouchers for your health care. Medical marijuana makes us need less medicine and doctor visits. So that's proven that that's in that ballpark. We need to state the case, the facts that cannabis help us live better and it's cheaper. And
Have a
those are the
question,
things that
Edmund?
need to be said to the president and to a national. Let him bring people from other countries here too. We need to schedule that before November. That's what I would say, because we got too much white women are the #1 women getting killed in New York. Black kids are the #1 getting killed in Florida. Texas is the #1 state
Edmund,
with 40% jobs. So what we're leaving ourselves to be crushed, really, to be crushed. And we shouldn't. We should speak our rights and stand for who we are. And I hope in Sacramento, the DA, they can do that to make it a national talk about medical cannabis in America before November the 6th. Thank you.
Question?
How about taking a two-track approach? All the stuff you're talking about, all the legislation, all of the DCCC and the Democratic Party, etc. How about taking the second track, which would lead to Occupy City Hall and everything that implies?
I would say this. I mean, this is maybe not speaking in my day job hat. I mean, case in point is, if you asked me, my experience in politics, a lot of times politicians will only do what you make them do.
Right.
And so the fact that the San Francisco United campaign has shifted gears and has started to actually engage that reality, which is, if you want to target Melinda Haig, then target her, right? I mean, make people understand that that issue is going to be real and it's not going to go away. It's as much as a one-day occupation to a long-term, to whatever tactics are necessary to achieve the outcome within a given framework. And so I think it's great. I'm happy to see the United campaign. I think it's very effective. Whether that's Occupy or whoever that tactic is, I think more power to it. I think right now our backs are against the wall. So I think that everything should be, cards are on the table as far as what the best way to do that. Simply sending, I would argue this, emails, form letters, it's been there, done that, right? I mean, I work in a political office. Every time I see a form letter that clearly was sent by an automated machine, it's dismissed. I don't care how many we get. It's generated someplace else. It's not from somebody, right? Much different when people physically come to your office or physically come to any location and then want to speak with you that way.
Well, just let me say one last thing, and then I'll relinquish the floor. Anybody that wants to follow what's coming down the pike in terms of Occupy City Hall can follow the events on our blog site, and it's also going to serve as an archive. And the blog site is very simple to remember. It's all lowercase. It's fightthemachine.org. Fight-the-machine.org. Go there.
Thank you. Questions about the bill or politics in Sacramento? Yes.
I'm from up north, and I find that all the people that are involved in marijuana are very hush-hush, and they're not willing to be on board and talk openly about marijuana. Anybody that's growing for a profit, they feel like they'd be putting a target on their back if they're to put themselves in a position where they're pro-marijuana. So this organization and trying to get people to come together on this is going to be a very hard thing to do because of the atmosphere that prevails. It's, people just don't want to step up. And nobody that I know in my world wants to be involved with marijuana for profit or not, and everybody's involved with it, but nobody wants to talk about it. So that's what I find.
Hard but not impossible. That's the nature of organizing. Hard but not impossible, right? It's got to start someplace. And I hear you. But at the same sense, there's too much at stake. There is too much at stake for this issue. There's too much at stake for this history for people to actually just be silent or take a pass on it. I mean, that's essentially...
I've had people actually get mad at me because I talk openly. I've wanted to be on board and pay the taxes per plant, or I've signed up with the zip tag program that Sheriff Allman has. I've done everything that I could to be on board, and I've been ostracized from my constituents because I'm willing to talk to people about this issue. Nobody else wants to. at least not from my perspective.
In talking about the taxes, Quentin, and then something that you brought up, one of my questions is, in terms of, I know you haven't yet received the fiscal analysis, but in terms of prepping for moving into appropriations and that sort of, can you talk a little bit about the legislation's, sort of what the fiscal impact might be, what we might expect from that fiscal impact report, sort of how is money generated, where does it go?
Right.
And ultimately the bottom line, I think, for patients is sort of how is that money going to impact
Right.
patients and our bottom line.
So the AB 2312 authorizes local governments to impose a tax of up to 2.5%. By not, and this is a key issue for Sacramento, by not imposing the tax directly, it avoids the 2/3 requirement. To impose a tax in Sacramento due to Prop 13 requires 2/3 passage, which essentially would mean death to any bill. It generally does in Sacramento. So what we've done is authorizing local governments and setting a ceiling for that tax of 2.5%. That tax would then go into a medical marijuana fund. That fund would go towards covering some of the enforcement costs and the regulatory costs that the Bureau of Enforcement for the medical cannabis would incur throughout the state. We're still figuring out exactly what those numbers would look like as far as what the appropriations cost would be, but when you are creating a new regulatory framework, it does incur quite a bit of cost. There's staffing, there's just a general, do I think some of those costs are somewhat inflated for almost any bill? Yes. But we're trying to offset that by having the authorized tax that would then be drawn down by, we're trying to create a self-funding mechanism, basically, for the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Enforcement. How the exact logistics work out, we've left it, we're not as prescriptive in the bill as some may or may not like. We try and leave some of that open-ended for that body, if formed, to then decide for itself. But we wanted to make sure that we did set a ceiling for the tax and direct it specifically. So it would not necessarily be a general fund tax that the state of California would be able to recoup just for general costs and education or otherwise. It would be specific to the enforcement around the medical cannabis issue. There are, and I'll be honest in saying that, still quite a few open-ended questions as to some of those details that we are still in the process of dealing with. My guess is the appropriations staff with the committee analysis will give us new questions for us to answer as far as specificity about where exactly that tax should be spent, what restrictions on spending for that money would look like, and how best it could go back into the medical cannabis sort of process.
And so just in terms of the ceiling at the local jurisdictions, does that get raised eventually by the local jurisdiction, or would that have to be raised
By the Bureau.
by the Bureau?
Exactly. And so that would just be clear. So there would still be the sales tax, right? And then in addition to that, jurisdictions could impose another tax of up to 2.5% specific to the sale of medical cannabis.
Not by weight? For sales,
For sales,
and that by weight?
by value.
Now how,
So the
Now, they
fees tax is similar to what they have in San Jose and Oakland?
So similar, yeah.
it'd be a certain, like a 1 pound increments, or how are they gonna do it?
That remains to be seen. It would be essentially by, it's not a price, this is the catch, it's not necessarily a price setting mechanism. Very careful to avoid any touching of setting a price or pegging a price towards the value of medical cannabis. It would be probably a percentage of sales.
It'd be graded in different levels, according.
Potentially, those questions would be left to the board, to the Bureau. That, as I mentioned to you, there's still several.
Who would decide the board? Who would decide the board?
The board is provided by, I'm going to blank so I don't have it in front of me. There would have to be a medical cannabis patient. There would have to be one representative from law enforcement. There would have to be, there are 2 representatives appointed by the governor. I think it's 4 for the governor and 5 for the speaker